in the quiet but watchful village of Kambala, where the red soil clung stubbornly to bare feet and every sound carried farther than secrets wished to travel, lived a woman named Salima. Long before she spoke a word, and while many admired her elegance and confidence, few understood the effort behind the image she maintained so carefully, because beneath the silk dresses, polished smiles, and expensive fragrances lay a secret Salima guarded with fear and denial, a secret rooted in her deep hatred of bathing, something she had avoided for years, choosing instead to drown her body in layers of perfume to mask the strong odor she pretended did not exist. And in a village where water was fetched from rivers and wells with respect and ritual, her avoidance went unnoticed only because her perfume was overwhelming, sweet and distracting, creating the illusion of cleanliness while slowly betraying her. And each morning, Salima would dress meticulously, spraying herself again and again until the air in her small hut became heavy, convincing herself that fragrance equaled freshness. Yet, as she stepped into the village paths, greeting neighbors and merchants, there were moments, sharp moments, when she noticed people pause, hesitate, or glance at one another. But pride forced her to ignore these signs, for admitting the truth would mean confronting a fear she had buried since childhood, a fear born from a traumatic incident when she nearly drowned in a river and was mocked instead of comforted, an experience that left her associating water with humiliation rather than cleansing. And so perfume became her armor, her shield against memory. But armor weakens when worn too long, and slowly the village air began to carry whispers, subtle at first, then more pointed, as children covered their noses playfully and elders frowned quietly, sensing something unnatural beneath the sweetness, until one afternoon in the bustling market, as Salima laughed confidently while buying spices, an old herbalist leaned back suddenly and murmured a prayer under her breath, her eyes filled not with judgment but concern. And in that moment, Salima felt a strange tightening in her chest, a warning she chose to ignore. Yet, as she walked away, her heart beat faster than usual, because deep down she knew perfume was no longer hiding the truth but exposing it, mixing with sweat and heat to create something unsettling. And that night, alone in her hut, surrounded by empty perfume bottles, Salima stared at her reflection and whispered that she was fine, that nothing was wrong, even as her skin itched and her mind raced with fear, unaware that this fragile balance she had maintained for years was about to shatter, and that the village she believed was blind had been watching all along. As the days passed in Kambala village, Salima began to feel the weight of invisible eyes following her wherever she went, because what had once been admiration was slowly turning into suspicion. And though no one spoke openly, the silence itself had become loud, pressing against her ears with every step she took. And at night she lay awake listening to the distant sounds of drums, insects, and murmured conversations drifting through the thin walls of her hut, convinced that her name was being spoken somewhere in the darkness. Yet, instead of facing the growing tension, Salima doubled her efforts to hide, buying stronger perfumes from traveling traders and layering them until her small room felt suffocating, telling herself that scent could overpower truth if only she used enough of it. and the strain of daily movement slowly betrayed her, causing the sweet fragrances to clash with something sour and heavy, something unmistakably human. And it was during the women's cooperative meeting, held in a crowded mud-brick hall under the unforgiving afternoon sun, that the fragile wall Salima had built began to crack. Because, as she entered and took her seat among the women, a sudden pause spread across the room, not dramatic but noticeable, like a breath being held, and whispers fluttered like startled birds. And Salima felt sweat gather at the base of her neck, knowing that sweat was her enemy. Yet she smiled and pretended nothing was wrong, participating in discussions about harvests and family matters while discreetly dabbing herself with scented cloths, until the heat grew unbearable and the air thickened. And that was when a young girl, innocent and unfiltered, leaned toward her mother and asked loudly why Auntie Salima smelled sweet but also bad, a question that fell into the room like a stone dropped into water, sending ripples of laughter, shock, and embarrassment in every direction. And though some women scolded the child for her bluntness, the damage was done, because Salima felt her chest tighten and her vision blur as every eye turned toward her, no longer polite or distant, but curious and confirming. And in that moment she realized that her secret was no longer hers alone, that the perfume had failed her, and that denial had only delayed the inevitable. Yet, instead of admitting the truth, she laughed awkwardly and blamed the heat, standing up quickly and leaving the hall before anyone could say more, walking fast through the village paths with tears burning behind her eyes, her pride wounded more deeply than her fear. And that evening she locked herself inside her hut, scrubbing her body with dry cloths soaked in perfume until her skin felt raw, refusing to let water touch her, because water meant memories, and memories meant weakness. And as empty bottles clinked softly around her feet, Salima finally allowed herself to wonder if the village was beginning to see through the illusion she had so carefully maintained, unaware that fate had already decided that her secret would not remain hidden much longer. The annual Yam Festival arrived with its usual excitement, filling Kambala village with music, color, and celebration. And for Salima, the festival represented both opportunity and danger, because it was the one day when everyone gathered closely, dancing shoulder to shoulder under the open sky. Yet staying away would raise more suspicion than attending, so she prepared herself carefully, bathing not with water but with excessive layers of perfume, convincing herself that the stronger the fragrance, the safer she would be. And as she stepped into the festival grounds, dressed in her finest clothes, she held her head high, determined to reclaim her confidence. But the sun was merciless that day, beating down on the crowd and drawing sweat from every body. Salima joined them, smiling widely, while her heart raced with fear, because she could feel the perfume mixing with heat and sweat in a way she could not control. And slowly, people around her began to shift away, their smiles fading into confused expressions, until murmurs rose again, louder than before, following her movements like a shadow. And just as Salima considered slipping away unnoticed, dark clouds gathered suddenly above the festival grounds, and before anyone could react, rain poured down in a powerful, unexpected downpour, soaking clothes, washing faces, and erasing appearances without mercy. And while the villagers laughed and danced in the rain, Selima froze, because the water stripped away the perfume she relied on, revealing the truth she had spent years hiding. And within moments, the strong odor she feared rose openly into the air, raw and undeniable, causing people nearby to recoil in shock, stepping back instinctively as whispers turned into gasps. And someone shouted in disbelief that Selima never bathed, a statement that echoed painfully across the open space. And though no one meant to be cruel, the exposure was complete, because nature itself had revealed her secret without apology. And overwhelmed by shame, Selima pushed through the crowd and ran, ignoring calls behind her, her feet slipping on the wet earth as tears blurred her vision. And in that moment, every memory she had avoided came rushing back: the river, the laughter, the fear. And she realized too late that by running from water she had allowed fear to control her life. And as she reached her hut and collapsed inside, listening to the rain drum against the roof, Selima understood that her secret was no longer a rumor or suspicion, but a known truth, and that the life she had built on perfume and denial had finally collapsed under the weight of exposure, leaving her with nothing but herself and the fear she could no longer escape. After the humiliating events of the Yam Festival, Selima withdrew completely from village life, closing her door to visitors and allowing days to blur into one another inside her small hut, where the smell of damp clothes, stale perfume, and shame lingered heavily in the air. And though the rain that had exposed her had long stopped, its consequences continued to pour relentlessly into her thoughts, replaying the shocked faces, the whispered words, and the sound of her own name spoken with disbelief. And for the first time, Selima could no longer pretend that perfume was enough, because the illusion had been publicly shattered, leaving her raw and defenseless. Yet even in isolation, she could not escape herself, as her skin itched uncomfortably and her body felt heavy, reminding her daily of the neglect she had justified for years. And still she resisted water, clinging to fear even as it poisoned her peace, until one quiet morning, as the sun rose gently over Kambala village, a soft knock came at her door, and when Selima opened it reluctantly, she found Mama Quito, the village healer, standing calmly, with eyes that carried neither judgment nor pity, but understanding. And without asking permission, Mama Quito stepped inside, sat on the floor, and spoke of wounds that fester when left untouched, explaining that fear often disguises itself as pride, and that true healing requires humility. Words that pierced Selima more deeply than any insult had. And though tears streamed down her face, she listened. And after a long silence, Mama Quito invited her to walk to a secluded stream beyond the village, promising that no one would see them, and with shaking legs, Selima followed, each step toward the water-stirring memories she had spent years suppressing. And when they reached the stream, clear and calm under the morning light, Selima froze, her breath shallow and her body tense. But Mama Quito guided her gently, teaching her how to breathe slowly, how to ground herself, and how to separate the past from the present. And as Selima allowed the water to touch her feet, then her legs, then her body, something inside her cracked open, releasing years of fear and denial, and she wept openly as the water cleansed her skin, washing away not only odor but the burden of avoidance she had carried for so long. And when she finally stepped out of the stream, trembling but renewed, Salima felt lighter, as though the water had returned something essential she had lost. And though shame still lingered, hope had quietly taken its place, marking the beginning of a transformation she had never believed possible. Returning to the village after her cleansing felt more frightening to Salima than facing the water itself, because water had been silent and honest, while people carried memories, opinions, and sharp tongues. And as she stepped onto the familiar path leading back to Kambala village, her heart pounded with uncertainty. Yet something was different, because for the first time in years she was not wrapped in layers of perfume but in a quiet sense of acceptance. And though the scent of soap and clean water was faint and simple, it felt real. And as villagers noticed her presence, conversations paused and eyes turned toward her, not with the same shock as before, but with curiosity, confusion, and cautious interest. And Salima resisted the urge to hide, walking steadily even as whispers followed her steps, until a group of women she once avoided approached her hesitantly. And instead of mocking her, one of them remarked softly that she looked peaceful, a comment that surprised Salima more than any insult could have, because peace had been absent from her life for a long time. And encouraged by this unexpected kindness, she decided to face the village openly, attending a community gathering where she stood before everyone, without fragrance to mask her presence or pride to shield her fear. And with a trembling but steady voice, she spoke honestly about her past, her near drowning, her shame, and the years she spent hiding behind perfume, admitting that fear had controlled her choices and that pride had kept her silent. And though silence followed her confession, it was not hostile, because many recognized themselves in her words, remembering their own hidden fears and unspoken struggles. And gradually murmurs of understanding replaced whispers of judgment. And while some villagers still laughed or shook their heads in disbelief, others nodded quietly, respecting the courage it took to speak the truth publicly. And in the days that followed, Salima noticed small but meaningful changes. As people greeted her without sarcasm, children stopped teasing her, and elders spoke to her with a gentler tone. And though not everyone forgave her immediately, Salima accepted this patiently, understanding that trust, like healing, takes time. And each evening she bathed without fear, allowing water to become a daily reminder that running away only strengthens what we fear. And as she settled into this new rhythm of honesty and care, Salima realized that her exposure, once the source of unbearable shame, had quietly opened the door to genuine connection, teaching her that being clean was not just about the body, but about facing oneself without disguise. As weeks turned into months, Salima's life in Kambala village began to take on a new shape, one built not on illusion but on consistency and care. Because each morning she bathed without hesitation, treating water no longer as an enemy but as a quiet companion in her healing. And though this change seemed simple to outsiders, it represented a profound victory over years of fear, and people noticed, not because she announced it, but because her presence felt different, lighter and calmer. And the overpowering cloud of perfume that once defined her was gone, replaced by a gentle, natural freshness that spoke of honesty rather than excess. And gradually the village's perception of Salima shifted, as whispers faded into conversations and conversations into respect, especially when she began speaking openly with young girls, sharing her story not as a warning filled with shame, but as a lesson about self-care, fear, and the danger of hiding behind appearances. And these conversations resonated deeply in a community where many silently struggled with their own insecurities. And Salima's willingness to expose her weakness became her greatest strength, allowing others to see vulnerability not as failure but as courage. And her story traveled beyond Kambala village through visiting traders and neighboring communities, spreading not as gossip but as a tale of transformation. And with this newfound purpose, Salima chose to use perfume differently, applying it sparingly during celebrations as a symbol of joy rather than a tool of deception. And each time she did, she smiled quietly, remembering the years she had used fragrance to hide instead of heal. And though memories of her past humiliation still surfaced occasionally, they no longer controlled her, because she had learned that pain loses power when faced directly. And as she walked through the village paths now, greeting neighbors with confidence rooted in truth, Salima understood that her life had been reshaped not by exposure alone, but by the courage to change after being exposed. And in this way, she became an unspoken example to others, showing that transformation does not require perfection, only honesty and persistence. With time, Salima's story settled into the heart of Kambala village, transforming from a moment of public shame into a lesson passed quietly from one generation to the next, because people came to understand that her struggle was not simply about bathing or perfume, but about fear, denial, and the courage required to confront both. And elders began referencing her experience during evening gatherings, not to mock her, but to remind listeners that secrets hidden behind pride eventually reveal themselves, often in ways far more painful than truth spoken early. And as children grew, they heard how Salima once tried to mask her reality with sweet fragrance, only to learn that no scent is strong enough to hide neglect or fear forever. And Salima herself embraced this legacy with humility, never pretending to be flawless, but always emphasizing that change begins the moment one stops running. And as she sat by the fire telling her story to young listeners, her voice calm and steady, she noticed how attentively they listened, understanding even at a young age that honesty carries power. And the village slowly adopted her lesson in small ways, encouraging cleanliness, openness, and emotional care, while also showing compassion toward. And whenever festivals arrived and perfume filled the air once more, people remembered Salima's journey and smiled knowingly, choosing water before fragrance and truth before appearance. And Salima, now older and wiser, found peace in the simplicity of her life, grateful that exposure had not destroyed her but refined her, teaching her that dignity is not preserved by hiding flaws but by facing them. And as stars filled the night sky above Kambala and the fire crackled softly, her tale remained alive, not as a warning meant to frighten, but as wisdom meant to guide, reminding all who heard it that real freshness comes from honesty. Healing begins with courage, and no secret can withstand the cleansing power of truth.